132. 132. There are at least two topics that are associated with this psalm beyond its being the 10th royal psalm. It is one of the so-called Songs of Ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T. Psalms 120 through 134 make up this 15 song set. And the songs, nobody knows for sure how it came about or what its purpose was, but there are a couple of reasonable assumptions. Number one, the song may have been sung by pilgrim groups as they ascended into Jerusalem for certain occasions such as Passover, Pentecost, Feast of Tabernacles, and so forth, the pilgrim journeys that were required to Jerusalem for all adult males. Or they may have been collected by the Levites, that's another theory, for singing one song on each step for each of the 15 steps leading into the temple. So the Levites would step on step 1, sing Psalm 120, go to step 2, sing Psalm 121, and so forth, working their way into the temple. The songs of ascent, when you tack on the end of them, from 134 is the last psalm of ascent. So if you tack on 135 and 136, you get what's called the Great Hallel, H-A-L-L-E-L. And it means, Hallel itself means praise of God, the song of praise. And these songs were sung by the Levites in the temple proceedings during these times of Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, dedication. As a royal psalm, however, it is a prayer for blessing on behalf of David and, by extension, for each Davidic king, each king in David's dynasty. The beginning point seems to include David's desire to build a temple as the house of God. And if you remember, this happened about the time when David brought the ark back into Jerusalem. He built a tent for it, a tabernacle, if you please. He constructed it in Jerusalem and brought the ark and placed it in that temporary structure. It was a time of great celebration, and the time then would have been shortly after David made Jerusalem his capital, by the way. So he had a lot of things going on. There was the loss of the ark for years to the Philistines, who finally had to give it up for a variety of reasons that you can read about in the Old Testament. But then David took Jerusalem, made Jerusalem his capital, and God designated Jerusalem as his center for worship, the place to which all these pilgrim journeys were to be made. Therefore, a number of items are of concern in this prayer. First is God's election of Zion as the center of worship. That's going to be part of this prayer. The presence of Yahweh in his own house. And was something David was very concerned about, of course. He said, I've got my house, but the Lord doesn't have his, and wanted to build a temple, and he wasn't permitted, of course. Then also there is the Davidic covenant, which arises in some form in virtually all of these royal psalms. So let's take a look at a relatively straightforward structure. It has two major sections. Each major section has three subsections. So we're going to move to a PowerPoint view of these three subsections in each of two sections. So 6 parts if you do the math. See, just look at it in a second. What you see before you, of course, is a picture of the structure, the 6-part structure, 2 major parts, each of 3 subparts, as we mentioned a few moments ago. Part A, step A, we have step A, B, and C as the first major section. A, prayer for David. That's in verse 10. It says verse 10, it's actually in verse 1. No editing taking place here, apparently. B is David's devotion to Yahweh, the description of that in verses 2 through 5. It includes a vow that David made to Yahweh. And then in step C, David's concern for Yahweh's presence in Jerusalem in the tent that David constructed for the ark as it was to be returned. That we find in verses 6 through 9, and that represents what we'll look at today, those 3 steps: the prayer for David, David's devotion to Yahweh, and David's concern for Yahweh's presence. And next session, we will look at A prime, B prime, and C prime, the second major section of 3 steps. The first is a second prayer for David in verse 10. B prime is God's reward to David. In a sense, God makes an oath for David or to David as well in verses 11 and 12. And finally, in C prime, we will describe and see the results of God's presence in Zion. God did go to the location of the ark. His presence was symbolized there in verses 13 through 18, and we get a sense for what that meant to the people. Well, let's go back and let's begin verse 1, taking a look at the prayer for David as we examine the first half of our 10th Royal Psalm, Psalm number 132. So let's take a look at Psalm 132, beginning in verse 1. Remember, O Lord, on David's behalf, all his affliction. So what's he talking about? It is a prayer for something for the Lord to consider, but what is this affliction? Again, it's a prayer for David. So let's look at what his past and ongoing afflictions might have been. First was David's difficulties with King Saul. Remember, King Saul wanted to eliminate David because he knew David was a challenger to his own dynasty. Saul's son Jonathan would have been next in line when Saul passed, but Saul knew that David was a threat to that, so he wanted to kill David, made several attempts to do so. Second, securing Jerusalem for his capital brought hardships in battle. Those battles were not simple, so David had difficulty during these battles, but he wanted Jerusalem as his capital, and God wanted it as his center of worship. Third, there were difficulties that David faced as he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem after the 20 years at Kiriath Jearim, Jearim. That word's going to come up in a bit. What difficulties? Well, they were brought because of errors in the method of transport of the ark. Remember, God's direction was that no one was to touch the ark. There were loops on the ark, or rings on the ark, through which poles could be placed, and poles were to be used to carry the ark. But David chose a new, fresh ox cart to carry the ark. And during that time, the ox cart hit some mud or a pothole or something, and the ark started to tip a bit. Uzzah reached out and touched it. He was one of the priests who knew better, but instinctively he did that, and he died instantly. And then the ark was at Obed-Edom's house for some period of time. Obed-Edom was blessed as long as the ark was there, but it was another delay in getting the ark back to Jerusalem. And then we don't even have to mention the attitudes of David's wife, because when they were on the way, David got excited, started to dance, and evidently made some displays that his wife did not care for. That's a minor point, not critical to the issue, but it was one of the things stacking up, I suspect, in David's mind and his heart. So, our psalmist now, in the next 4 verses, begins with a summary of David's devotion to his God, including, I believe we'll find that a vow that David made to God. Starting in verse 2 of Psalm 132, how he, that is David, swore to the Lord, here's the vow, and vowed to the mighty one of Jacob. He said, surely I will not enter my house, nor lie on my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes, or slumber to my eyelids. Sort of emphasizing, I guess he said, I'm not going to rest, verse 5, until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. That, of course, is Yahweh. Again, we're back in, we've had parallelism all along in these Psalms, something we've discussed, but notice them again. In verse 2, swore and vowed, same thing. Verse 3, my house, my bed. Some believe that when he was speaking of house, he was talking about his inner chamber where his bed would have been found. Verse 4, no sleep, no slumber. Verse 5, a place and a dwelling place. And the parallelism in the names of Yahweh, Lord, which is Yahweh, and the mighty one of Jacob, 2 different names of the God of Israel. As a side note here, what is it? Well, it says the mighty one of Jacob appears first in Jacob's final blessing on Joseph just before Jacob's death. I thought it was of interest. It has some connection, I think. I'm looking at Genesis 49, verses 22, 23, and 24. And here's what Jacob said as a blessing for Joseph. Remember, Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. Reuben was the firstborn, but Joseph was a favorite, and he wasn't even early on. I don't know, Joseph, what, number 7, 8, 9, somewhere in there. And it goes something like this. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring, which would just emphasize the fruitfulness and the greenness and the strength and the well-being of a tree. Its branches run over a wall. In other words, it's a sizable tree. It's well endowed with branches and leaves and fruit. Verse 23, the archers bitterly attacked him, and shot at him and harassed him. David had military opposition. He also had political opposition, but here it's speaking, I'm sure, of primarily of military opposition. David was a warrior. He was a warrior king. But his bow remained firm, and his arms were agile. Again, things enhanced and made possible by God. God was the one responsible for David's training, his ability. And to finish up verse 24, from the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. So there it is. He said those military capabilities of Jacob were at the hand of God. God was responsible. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Notice again the notion of Yahweh as the great divine warrior, enhancing the warrior king. Excuse me, David. Yahweh had granted David military victories all over the place. David then planned to build a temple to his God. By the way, the military victories that David had led to Israel's biggest boundaries, Israel's most productivity, Israel's greatest prosperity of any time. It was enhanced and kept going for a while by Solomon, but David is the one who made Israel to be the best that Israel could be, the biggest, most powerful, most influential that it had ever been. Let's look at 2 Samuel now 5, because I want to get at this notion of David wanting to build a temple just for a moment. Chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, verse 12. And David realized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel. David knew who made him king, and that he had exalted, God had exalted David's kingdom, or Israel's kingdom, or God's kingdom, take your pick, for the sake of his people Israel. Then if we jump a couple chapters ahead to chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, it says, Now it came about when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest on every side from all of his enemies, these would be military enemies, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, so David's talking to the prophet Nathan, See now, I dwell in the house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within tent curtains. That's a tent that David constructed to house the ark temporarily. The tent curtains refers to that tent, or tabernacle if you wish. Some translations do call it a tabernacle, although it's not the same tabernacle that was made and constructed during the 40-year wandering. So David had built a house for the Ark of the Covenant, a tabernacle, but no temple. David had concerns for the glory of the Lord and with Israel's blessedness that came from God's presence. So he knew that if there were a temple in Jerusalem, God's presence would be in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem would be protected and blessed. But of course, as we know, most of us, that David was not permitted to build a temple. That was left to Solomon. Why? God said, you're a warrior king. You have blood on your hands from not only the warrior king, but from the Bathsheba incident as well. So God said, no, it's not for you to do. That David did help collect the wherewithal financially and otherwise to help Solomon in the building of the temple. Well, what was the importance of God's presence again? We've mentioned it. Back in Exodus, during the wilderness wandering days, God promised to dwell with his chosen people. We see that in Exodus 25, verse 8, where it says, "And let them construct a sanctuary," this was the tabernacle at that time, "for me, that I may dwell among them." And the psalmist moves to emphasize David's concern for God's presence with Israel. So let's move back to Psalm 132 and look at verses 6 through 9, those 4 verses. Likely David and his men and his men could be a reference to the people of Israel. And you're going to see that coming up here, so I'm jumping the gun a bit. "Behold, we heard of it." Who's the we? Probably David and his men, but again, it could be all of Israel heard about it. Heard about what? The Ark of the Covenant. We heard about it in Ephratah, Ephrathah. We found it in the field of Jaar, Jaar. And we'll get to those terms in a minute. Let us go, because most of us have heard of Ephratah in another matter. Verse 7, "Let us go into his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool," his being God's. Let's go to God's dwelling place. Let us worship at God's footstool. And many considered the Ark of the Covenant to be God's footstool on earth. Verse 8, "Arise, O Lord, to thy resting place," which would be to thy house, which should be in Jerusalem, "thou and the ark of thy strength." Now remember, though, this is at David's time. There was no temple yet. There was just the tabernacle that David had constructed. But he still asked God to go there, be there, his presence there. "Let thy priests be clothed with righteousness, and let thy godly ones sing for joy." So there's a tendency here to take Ephratah to mean Bethlehem. Bethlehem Ephratah, you remember from the Christmas story. But don't think that's what it means here. Most scholars seem to believe that Ephratah refers to the region around Obed-Edom's house in the region of Kiriath Jearim. Now, what's the connection there with Jaar, J-A-A-R? Well, it turns out that Jearim, Jearim, is the plural. The I am ending is the plural form for Hebrew. Jearim is the plural form for J-R. So, J-R is likely a substitute name for Kiriath Jearim. Jearim, again, the plural of J-R. So, verse 7 tells us that evidently the people, especially David's men and David himself, were encouraged by the promise of God's presence at the return of the ark. In verse 8, Yahweh was encouraged to show his presence as the ark is brought into his choice of place for worship, into Jerusalem, within the tabernacle David had constructed. In verse 8, we found an invitation for God to join his ark in Jerusalem, the ark being considered his footstool of his rule on earth. And David, his anointed king, was the source of that earthly rule. Let's go back for a minute to Psalm 99. I want to show you something. Psalm 99, the first 2 verses. "The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim. There's that I am. Angels, plural. It's a visual reference to the mercy seat on the ark. There was a cherub on either end of the ark, their wings over the seat, the mercy seat, or the seat of reconciliation, or the kippah, the cover of the ark. And he says, then let the earth shake. Now notice whenever you have the presence of God in some form, you virtually always have some kind of cosmic disturbance indicated. This is not just some dude coming in to the ark. This is God Almighty. And then it finishes in verse 2, the Lord is great in Zion. Zion referring to the region of Jerusalem. And God, Yahweh, is exalted above all the peoples. And generally when you see the peoples is a plural, and we're going to see that in one of our upcoming Psalms. Those of you who were with us when we did Hosea, do you remember Lo Ami and Ami? Lo Ami meaning not my people, when God was ticked at the northern kingdom, and Ami, my people. But if you go to Amim, A-M-M-I-M, you have the peoples. That typically refers to Gentile nations. So, in verse 9, the priests were God's instruments in Israel, and this is back in verse 9 of Psalm 132. We get back here again. In that place, the priests were God's instruments in Israel, and the purveyors of victory, blessing, and deliverance from Yahweh. So there is the reference to the righteousness. And priests are not always considered righteous. They are human, they are created, and they have been corrupt at various times. But here they're saying, let the priest be the priest, let the priest do God's bidding, intervening between man and Yahweh. With the presence of the ark and the priests in their priestly attire, the people would have been encouraged to sing, dance, be joyful. That's the picture that's being painted of all of the excitement, the joy, the pleasure, the happiness from seeing the ark returned to the center of worship. Some claim that the placement of the ark in Jerusalem brought the wilderness wanderings to a final conclusion. Why? Well, the ark had never been in Jerusalem. You remember where the ark was brought and left for a considerable period of time? At a place called Shiloh, S-H-I-L-O-H. And that is even used sometimes as a name for Christ. Where had the ark been before Jerusalem? Well, we just let that cat out of the bag, right? At the tabernacle, the original wandering tabernacle in Shiloh. Now there is a new tabernacle in a new place, Jerusalem, Zion, and that means, in many people's mind, it signaled the end of that 40-year wandering period, which now, by David's time, of course, that had extended well beyond 40 years. What do you have next? Well, that means we're going to stop here. Going to go on next time in the last half of this Psalm 132. We'll finish up this prayer of David. We have looked at the first major section, and next time we will look at the second section, the last three parts of this psalm. We'll see.